This is a wrap-up video and a farewell to my 2023 GR Supra. Really enjoyed the experience ownership and just wanted to share some parting thoughts on this car. I'm coming from the perspective of someone who has owned a lot of both BMWs, have had E90 chassis and F80. I just sold a G20 M340i, but I've also had other sports cars, Porsches, and I did own a Mark IV 94 twin turbo Supra that was a Targa, yeah, I thought I'd give some impressions of what I think of the new car. The first impression you have is that this is actually a small car, and it's not tiny. You know, it weighs somewhere between 3,300 and 3,400 pounds. It is fairly diminutive, at least from today's standards, but it's not actually a whole lot shorter than a Mark IV and weighs roughly the same. Although this has the automatic, the manual versions are a little lighter. As everyone knows, the Supra is based on a BMW chassis. It's very closely related to the Z4, and got a lot of heat for that when it came out. You know, it's not a real Toyota, it's not a real sports car, it's just a BMW, blah, blah, blah. Well, and I don't blame people, because BMW spent a lot of the time after the E90 building bigger and kind of crappier cars. My F80, I had 3 different F80s, and F80 M3 and F80 M4, or F82 M4, a couple of F82 M4s. But don't think I ever loved those cars nearly as much as I liked the previous. I had several E90 M3s and liked those a lot, so was hoping for something that was more along the lines of those. And I do think that Toyota and BMW nailed it and were much closer to their roots of building, you know, decently sporty cars than they have in the past. It was kind of interesting comparing this car to the M340i that I owned at the same time. They're very similar drivetrains, both B58s with the ZF 8-speed automatic. But the M340i had the advantage of having the hybrid system, so it had a little bit of torque fill, but was almost 500 pounds heavier than this car. So definitely noticed the weight difference in those. And while the motor felt responsive, especially if you caught it sort of at 2,000 RPM without boost and stomped on it, the hybrid system would kick in. But this car's lighter and spools quick, and yes, you can catch the turbo off. If you can catch the turbo off boost, it does have a little bit of lag, but in most kinds of driving, you won't ever feel that. This car is great, but I did make some notable changes. BMWs, being a strut front suspension, are camber limited, and they chew up especially on the track, they'll chew up the outside of outside of your tires, and you don't get much life out of your tires, plus the car understeers like crazy. So I put on camber plates, and when I was in there with camber plates, I thought I might as well put coilovers in the car, so I got Öhlins coilovers. And the Vorschlag and Öhlins coilovers don't get along that well. You either have to run the springs fairly low, and they come unseated when the car is jacked up, which isn't a big deal, but it's the reality of the situation. Or you can do what I did, which is replace the springs with slightly stiffer Swift springs and helper springs to prevent the spring from coming unseated at full droop. Information on that in the comments. The other thing that I did were the SPL control arms. In the front, there is a caster bushing that the front of the trailing arm comes out of, and it really deflects quite a bit under heavy steering loads and makes the steering less precise. Replacing that with the SPL monoball was great. I also got some additional caster out of using an adjustable monoball. And it's also great for making sure the sway bar doesn't run into the control arms, which can happen as you lower the car. The other thing that I did were the SPL front control arms. A lot of people find those redundant compared to when you're doing camber plates. The best use of the SPL arms is getting a little bit more camber with a stock suspension, and that's probably what I'd probably recommend those as a first suspension mod, since they're relatively uninvasive. But I ended up just doing them to take out the rest of the rubber in the front suspension when I did the rest of the suspension. And in the rear, you can see the car is a little bit traction limited. In the rear, what I've done is I replaced the thrust arms with SPL thrust arms. The stock thrust arms, like the front control arms, allow a decent amount of deflection. A lot of times that shows up as wheel hop when you accelerate hard, and the thrust arms really help not wheel hop when you accelerate hard and lose traction. The other thing I did in the rear were the adjustable toe arms and the toe adjustment lockout. Now, the reason I did that is that the BMWs use eccentrics in the toe control arms, and what I found is that no matter how hard you tighten them up, they can slip on track. So using a adjustable arm means that that'll stop. And that's about it as far as suspension mods that I did. I didn't really do any power mods. The car has enough power to spin the tires in first and second stock, and I figured that yes, I'd probably appreciate more power at the track, but with a 2023 car, all the 2021, 22, and 23 cars, the ECUs are locked, so tuning them becomes a little bit complex. So I opted not to do anything power-wise. Thought about doing the typical JB4 and a downpipe, but didn't get around to that. So I did drive the car a decent amount stock, and the changes I made, yes, the car rides a little bit rougher. The Öhlins do a reasonable job of approximating a factory suspension, probably 85% of the time, and they get a little harsh over especially repeated medium-sized bumps. But for the most part, if you adjust them correctly with the right preload, they ride pretty well. So I'd say that 80-85% of the time they rode pretty much indistinguishable from stock. Certain bumps, yeah, you could definitely tell that there was something going on, but it was never super harsh and wasn't bouncy. And I was pretty happy with the Öhlins overall. The SPL arms added another slight layer of harshness. There was just sort of a blanket layer of additional harshness, and I would actually say it was very similar to what you get out of, say, a GT3 versus a regular Carrera S or a Carrera GTS with the Sport Pasm suspension. There's definitely a little more harshness, especially over certain kinds of bumps, but it's pretty tolerable. No additional noises or funny noises. Camber plates, I'm very happy with the Vorschlag plates. My big fear with camber plates is always that they're going to make noise. I hate when camber plates make noise, so I wanted to make sure that we found some camber plates that weren't going to do that. And these have done a great job of that so far. They don't make noise. They don't rattle. You get a little bit of noise sometimes when you are at full lock at a parking lot, but never while you're actually driving. And I think those are mostly just the springs turning on the coilovers more than anything else. And some thrust bushings would likely solve that completely. But wasn't a big deal. So, how does the car actually perform? Well, we're not going to get much of it with a slow-moving CR-V in front of us, but when the traffic clears up, we'll talk a little bit more about it. Power-wise, it was pretty interesting. This car was very similar in acceleration to my BPU Mark IV, which I hate to say out loud because the Mark IV was with parts on it, was probably one of the fastest cars of its day, and the Supra today is certainly not that. But horsepower wars are crazy, and when the Mark IV was running, when I was running around with my Mark IV, having 450 horsepower was a decent amount, and it was easy to go further than that. The Mark IV had the funky twin turbo system, which was not the greatest. It set up from the factory. It was sequential, so you end up with these weird kind of peaks and valleys in the power, and you could change those to be a normal twin, just parallel, but it made the car fairly laggy. It was pretty gutless when the turbos weren't spooled up. I personally preferred them in parallel mode, and that's the way I ran the car most of the time, but because I didn't like the weird power bump, the bumps in the power band that came from the sequential turbos, especially when we were running more boost than stock. The Mark IV also was a decent but never a great handling car. It was fairly comfortable, but was never as comfortable as regular sedans at this age. And I'd say the Mark V actually does a better job of riding better stock than the Mark IV did. If that matters to you, probably doesn't. The Mark IV certainly had better steering feel, although it was never one of the best racks out there. Most hydraulic racks are just better in terms of feel and telling exactly what the wheels are doing. A lot of people associate steering feel with sort of a negative connotation, and I really like steering feel. And the main use case for me around steering feel is understanding exactly what the front tires are doing without having to feel it elsewhere in the chassis. You can, in a car that has a ton of steering feel, like a 997 GT3, for example, you can tell exactly when the tires start to slip and place the car really easily because of that. And a lot of modern cars have really tuned out a lot of the steering feel. You can still get a little of it back, especially in the best Porsche racks today, but most of the time, most cars today don't do a great job of that. This car is no exception to the electronic power in terms of steering. It's no exception to the norm of electronic power steering. It's accurate, it's really quick, you barely have to move your hands to go around corners, but it doesn't have a ton of steering feel. It's got a little bit. You can get an idea of what's going on with the wheel, but you're mostly telling through the seat of your pants rather than through what the wheel is, what you're being told through the wheel and your fingertips. You can see even there at half throttle, we're starting to lose a little bit of traction, but hopefully because of the thrust arms, no wheel hop, stayed nice and planted, even though it was stepping out a little bit. The 2023 Supra got a little bit of extra damping, and extra permissive traction control, which was nice. It certainly makes the car a bit more fun to drive in the corners while still having some safety net. I got really used to having the Porsche PSM, which does allow a decent amount of slip angle, so it's nice to see the Japanese manufacturers, and probably more accurately the other European manufacturers like BMW getting on board with that as well. In terms of the chassis, this is a very short wheelbase car. It's not quite as short as a 911, but it's actually shorter than a 718 GT4, which is pretty incredibly short given how wheelbases have grown over time. And what that gives this car is a really tossable feeling in corners. You feel like you could do whatever you want to and place the car easily, and it's very responsive, and it goes around corners nicely. I really enjoy this car on twisty roads, and actually more than I expected to. With the stock tires, it has an appropriate amount of grip for the amount of chassis control it has. I mean, sure, it doesn't stick as well as, say, my 718 Spyders on Pilot Sport Cup 2s, but it's very fun to drive in corners. And the chassis is fairly well balanced with the amount of power it has. You can step the tail out when you want to, but it's very controllable and easy to drive. The Olins certainly help out with some of the damping. I think that this car, the stock dampers were decent. What I didn't like from the factory was that there was a decent amount of bump steer, and this car would get a little upset over corners that had bumps in it, and that wasn't super fun. But I found that the SPL arms really take care of that well. The other thing that the SPL arms do is help put power down coming out of the corner. These cars are traction limited coming out of corners, and it is nice to have a bit more consistency in terms of the way that the car puts power down leaving a corner. So I'd highly recommend doing the SPL bits, the caster arm bushings up front, the adjustable control arms, and the rear lockouts and the thrust arms are, I think, the most important thing. Then if you're going to lower the car, the bump steer adjustable steering arms are really nice too. I didn't lower the car that much, so didn't get those. Power-wise, I think these cars punch above their weight a decent amount. I owned an M2 competition prior, and this car feels faster to me by seat of the pants. According to the published specs, it's not a whole lot faster, but I was impressed with it from that perspective. It also sounds pretty decent stock. I like the way the B58 sounds. The one disadvantage of the G80 or the F80 mainly was that it sounded pretty bad once you opened it up. The S55 was a particularly obnoxious sounding motor. It made a lot of sort of farting noises when it shifted, and was just never one that I really wanted to push. And what I found is that the B58 sounds better. It's a creamy, traditional BMW inline six sound, lots of sort of synthetic pops and crackles, and it's definitely sporty enough to be fun and sound good. So I would say one of the things that this car is probably not the best at is braking. The brakes on this car are just a little bit mushy coming out of the factory. I suspect a lot of that has to do with the sliding rear calipers at the back. The brake feel is not great, even though the stock pads are actually pretty decent. They're Brembo front brakes with Brembo pads that are up to at least producing braking force at the track for a little while. The problem with them is they wear really quickly when you push them. And the brake feel is a little mushy. One of the things that surprised me the most on this car was I heard a few people swearing by the Veris master cylinder brace, and I always thought those were a little bit silly. But I gotta say, I was surprised that when I put the Veris master cylinder brace on, it did firm up the brake feel a decent amount, and it was noticeable. I actually am noticing that I don't have that right now, and that the pedal is a little squishier because of it. So yeah, that's odd. The transmission in this car, for the most part, is as good as any DCT I've driven, and I think that's high praise. A lot of the car, I would say short of Porsche's PDKS and the latest GT3, there's definitely room for improvement for Toyota for ZF versus the Porsche PDK transmissions. But compared to most others, this transmission is surprisingly good. It's very responsive to paddles. It does what you want it to do, and the main complaint about traditional torque converter automatics is they don't do or they do random things sometimes. They'll upshift when you don't want them to, or they'll downshift when you don't want them to. And this transmission is really good about that. The only time that I find that this transmission gets a little confused is when it's in manual mode in the first or second to third shift. Sometimes it just doesn't do it exactly when I want it to. So I do notice that. I always prefer manually actuating gears on track, except with my latest 991 GT3 I did. But I had a PDK. I've had 2 manual GT3s and 1 PDK. And the PDK one, I was not slower, at least, when I was shifting myself, but certainly I was taking better lines around the track when I was letting the car shift itself. And there's pretty much no other car that I've been really comfortable with doing what it does on its own. This car seems pretty good about that, not doing unpredictable things, and it seems like in automatic mode it mostly does what you need it to do on the track. So it's got that going for us. But yeah, I'm pretty impressed with the transmission in this car. I originally was going to get a manual Supra. I had ordered one and ended up finding this one slightly discounted from MSRP versus most people are paying markups if they weren't smart enough to order the cars ahead. And I picked this up for a bit under MSRP and selling it for a bit under MSRP as well. So pretty happy with both the value retained and the price. There's probably nothing else for mid-50s that I would rather have over this car. There's as a performance car, at least. This car does a lot of things really well. It goes around corners well. It sounds good. It's satisfying to drive. You can drive it a little bit silly and drive with the tail out if you want. You can also keep a tidy line, and the car seems perfectly happy with that as well. How much do I miss not having a stick in this car? Well, in any sporty car, I prefer having a manual transmission on a twisty road. It just adds an additional layer of interaction with the road and with the car. And I enjoy manual transmissions. I started driving manuals, and I remember the days where automatics were just terrible and never did what you wanted them to do. Of course, it's a different story when the automatic does everything you want it to do. It allows you to focus on the chassis and the line you're taking. It also takes less attention, so if you want to slide the car around, and in slidey cars that are decently quick, it's kind of nice to have an automatic to let it do its thing while you slide the car around. I'd say this car falls in between those categories. It's got a playful chassis with a super short wheelbase. It's easy to break loose. It's easy to recover, and I could certainly see enjoying driving a version of this with a manual transmission. So I'm sure that I will try that soon. I have a few friends that have the manual transmission cars, and I will shoot a video of me driving one of those, comparing it to this car. But as far as automatics go, this is about as good as it gets, and like I said, I can't think of very many transmissions that I think are better. ZF and BMW have finally done enough work to make this a world-class sports car transmission, which I appreciate. And then it was interesting having both the BMW M340i LCI and this car at the same time. This car has a version of what I believe is iDrive 6, still fully functional. I actually find that I spend most of my time in CarPlay, so I don't notice the iDrive improvements. BMW had a huge opportunity with the M340i with it didn't have any fixed gauges. They could have displayed everything they wanted to, and rather than making sensible fixed gauges, BMW put bar graphs. I mean, really? Bar graphs went out of style in the 80s for dashboards. They're blocky, don't show very much granularity. You don't get the sweep of a needle or the readability at a glance. Yeah, it's pretty disappointing with that. I do like the Supra's dash. It's a little bit austere and is missing the big area on the right side that's a screen. There's a lot of wasted real estate there. But the middle of the dash being a big tachometer is nice. I'm not huge on the gas gauge and the temperature gauge. This car only has 7 gradations for each, and I'd like a little more granularity, especially with fuel. With temperature, I couldn't care less at this point because most cars don't actually show coolant temp varying because people freak out. But yeah, some more granularity in the secondary gauges would be nice. This car is a premium edition, and it has the automatic cruise control, the distance keeping cruise control, which works fairly well. I was decently impressed with how seamless that was. The one thing I will complain about in terms of Toyota is that the M340i and the Toyota have the same speakers. Obviously, the Toyota emplacements are different because the body's different, but this stereo is probably the worst I've heard in a current production car in quite some time. It is really, really bad. It's really a bad sounding stereo. This is not something I would normally complain about in a car review, but I'd be remiss in not mentioning it because it's probably got the worst stereo of any modern car that I've been in, and I've even rented some really crappy doozies, and whew, this car is bad. The stereo is terrible. The controls for it are fine. It's CarPlay, so you got all your music, but the sound is just terrible. It's thin. There's 2 fairly large subwoofers right behind the front seats, and they still can't make this car have any bass. The mid bass is really disjointed and thin. There's some trouble. The center channel helps a little bit with imaging, but whoo-wee, this is not a good sounding stereo. Gotta love one-lane roads. So my benchmark on this particular road is a Miata. Most cars larger than a Miata are too big to actually be fun to toss around this. My 718 Spider was actually pretty fun on this road too. It doesn't quite have the compact and easy placement of a Miata, but also had just insane amounts of grip given how good that chassis is. This car is very agile. It's easy to place on a road like this. The turn-in is good. The steering is quick. Even on the 90-degree hairpins, it's easy to place the car, get around where it needs to go. This road is decently bumpy. It's one of the. I would say that it's probably a little bumpier than is ideal for the suspension, although it's handling it mostly okay. I can't really see the nose of the car, so it's not the easiest to place in this. And I would be remiss. The other thing I'd be remiss in not pointing out in this car is that the visibility forward is probably mediocre to okay, but anything behind your shoulders is pretty hard to see. It has huge C-pillars. The rearward visibility out of the mirror is and hatchback is like a gun slit, and the weird shape of the road roof right here means that for anyone who's decently tall, it's pretty hard to see out of the side. especially because this is right at eye level, so anything above eye level is pretty hard to see out of this car. So I knew that going in. I knew that the visibility in this car was not going to be great, but it was, and I think it was just as bad as I expected it to be. Driving position wise, one of the things that Japanese cars are typically not well built for are people like me with tall torsos. This being a BMW, I was pleasantly surprised to fit. One of the reasons I did buy the Supra in the first place was the fact that I fit in the car with a decent amount of headroom. A lot of people find this car fairly cramped feeling. I think this roof shape has a lot to do with it, and the poor visibility is also a factor as well. I will say that from a driving position and ergonomics, I think the car is pretty good. The steering wheel adjusts nicely. You've got plenty of room, plenty of visibility toward the gauges, and a nice small compact wheel. The seats are decently supportive. They're definitely not as good as in terms of holding you as the carbon fiber buckets that were in the GT3. They're definitely not even as good as the adaptive sport seats that were in my 911 Turbo S. But as far as Japanese sports car seats, I'd say they're okay for decent sized people. If you're on the smaller size, say closer to 100 to 125 pounds, you'll probably find the seats have you'll swim around a little bit in them. They do have power adjustable bolsters and seat memory, which is nice, but I wouldn't say that the bolsters give you a ton more. The adjustable bolsters end up giving you a ton more support. So you might, especially on the bottom of the seat, you're probably going to slide around a little bit. And given that they're this midline kind of cheap leather, you may slide around a decent amount. I actually think the base Supra seats with the Alcantara might be stickier from that perspective, but yeah. Ergonomically, the center console is a little bit weird. Like, I don't know why this sort of wall thing is there, and the phone holder is a huge pain in the butt. It has this hooded cover which keeps your phone in place, which is nice. The wireless charger makes sure your phone doesn't fall off the wireless charger. It's a little bit hard to get your phone into. You got to kind of get it in straight. Most people with a plus size phone will find that it won't fit. The wireless charger is odd. My phone actually gets really hot from the wireless charger, so if I'm using CarPlay on the wireless charger, my phone will sometimes overheat after maybe 30 minutes of driving, which is no fun. I will say that having the physical buttons on the car is way preferable to newer cars that are going to all haptic touch. The M340i went to all haptic buttons, and it's pretty terrible for that. Car has plenty of tractability. I mean, coming out of corners at 3,000 RPM, there's a nice shove of turbocharged torque waiting for you. So it squirts out of corners well and keeps building. I would say that it doesn't. You certainly know when to shift. It's not one of those cars that'll run you into red line, like maybe a Alfa Romeo But yeah, I do really enjoy this car on a twisty road. It's got a good amount of grip. It's slidey and fun, and turns in well. Allows good placement. Well, if you're shopping for a GR Supra, I hope this helps make some of your decisions easier. I really like the car. I think there's nothing in the price range that I would rather have. I haven't had a lot of seat time in the new Z, but from what I understand, it's quite a bit slower in a straight line, and don't really see the advantage of that over the Supra, unless you like sort of nostalgic looks. The Supra's aesthetics are probably questionable, although I don't think it's an ugly car. It's certainly, it's more interesting than beautiful. I do like it from a lot of different angles, especially with some of the small parts I've put on it, the carbon fiber ducktail and the side skirts, and lowering a little bit with bigger wheels certainly makes it a little bit more attractive in my eyes. And I really like the side view. There's no getting around the fact that this car's got a really long nose, at least from an aesthetic point of view. But I think that it looks best from the rear and side angles. Other than that, well, I'd love to know if you have any questions that I can answer about the Supra. I've certainly enjoyed my time with it, and hope this is helpful for anyone looking at them.